But guys, after bishop to b7 in this position, here white can also continue with knight to d4, centralizing the both knights. And suppose if bishop takes d4, then that will be a bad idea for black, because after rook takes d4, now you can see white is threatening to give a check so that he can grab this bishop. And suppose to tackle this, if black decides to castle, then here white can however goes for knight to d6, attacking this bishop. And after bishop to c6, now comes e4. A very beautiful move, which first of all opens the diagonal of this dark square bishop, and secondly, white can continue by launching an attack towards the king side. And by this, you can see this position will be better for white. Okay, so in the actual game, after b3, and by this you can see black successfully connected both the rooks, and at any time he can bring the h rook into the game and move his king to safety if required. Okay, so here some of you might be thinking that why not bishop to d5? This is because suppose after knight to a5, if black goes for bishop to d5, now in this position white can actually sacrifice his rook by rook takes d5. Now if black captures with any of this piece, then knight takes d5, then it won't affect white. White will still give a check by knight to c6 check. And you can see white will win a rook after suppose king to f8, knight takes d8, rook takes d8. But some of you will be thinking that after all this, what does white actually get from this? I mean, white is not any piece up, so what's the point of doing this all? Basically, the point behind this that now white can continue with rook to d1 and then bishop to f3, targeting this active knight, and in the next move white can also bring his knight to d3, which will target this bishop. Basically, now I think you all understand that the black pieces which are not perfectly coordinated becomes an easy target of the white pieces, whereas the white pieces are perfectly coordinated, and this bishop on b2, as you can see, is eyeing on this important diagonal. So that's why this makes the position better for white. Okay, so in the actual game, after bishop to e4, and basically white didn't capture this by his knight, because you can see he's already brought this knight back from this f3 square. So this f3 square is not a good outpost for this knight, whereas the d3 square, which will be a better outpost for it, because firstly it is targeting this bishop, and secondly this knight is now active and can jump from d3 to b4 and then to c6. And basically he brings his rook to c8 because the idea is simple. Basically he wants to bring this bishop to b4 so that in the next move he can by this you can see he's targeting both knights, and then he wants to bring his rook to second rank after he captured this knight, because this knight is guarding this c2 square. So that's why to tackle this here Kramnik instantly brings his knight to d3, which first of all targets this bishop, and now black has option to either go back to b6, or he can also continue with this amazing move knight to d5. This is because suppose if knight takes c5, rook takes c5, and if white tries to attack this by by e4, if he tries to attack this knight, simply knight to c3, attacking this rook. And here the best move for white is to just slide this rook to e1, so that he can support this central pawn. But suppose if he captured this knight on c3 by bishop takes c3, then after rook takes c3, and now you can see black is now targeting this f3 pawn. But what if king to g2? I mean, white successfully defended this pawn, but after that rook at a goes to c8, and then black can continue his attack by knight to e5 with the idea of taking this f3 pawn. And by this you can see this position will be completely better for black. Okay, so yeah, so let's go back to this move knight to d3. Yeah, after this move in the actual game he missed the move knight to d5, and instead he made a mistake by rook at a goes to b8. A good move by black, getting out from this threat of bishop a3, which will fork this rook and this king. But it's better for white to go for bishop to a3, but instead he decides to bring his bishop to d4, which is attacking this rook. But that's an inaccuracy because now Karpov successfully exchanges the rook, and that's an inaccuracy because by exchanging the rooks, you can see now white loses all of his advantage and the games become completely equal. Okay, so now it's better for black to go for e5, which attacks this bishop, but instead he goes for rook to a8. And the problem with that move is now white can bring this knight to b7 with the idea of knight to d6 check, which will be a very great outpost for this knight. But instead of doing this, he decides to slide his king to f1. And since this knight wants to go to d6 square, so that's why to stop this, here Karpov brings back his knight to c8, eyeing on this d6 square. And since black is threatening to play b4, so it's better for white to bring this bishop to d6, but or maybe on c5. But instead he goes for rook to c7, allowing black to go for b4, which attacks this bishop. And after bishop to c1, now you can see this bishop is not in a very good place, and there is not any active square left for this bishop where where white can place this. And now it's better for black to bring this rook into the game, but instead he decides to push this pawn to a4 so that he can activate his rook. But that's an inaccuracy, because now you can see white can activate his bishop by bishop to d2, which is now targeting this pawn on b4. Okay, so now it's better for black to just push h6, which will attack this knight. Or here, black can also give a check from this b5 square. But instead, he made an slight inaccuracy by playing this move h5. And now the best option for white is to bring this knight to f7 with the idea of knight to h8, which attacks this pawn on g6. And if black pushes g5, then this bishop on d8 will capture this pawn on g5. So, but here white missed that amazing move, and instead he goes for e4. And now he must continue with the knight to d6 check, but instead he made a mistake by knight to d4. Basically, he wants to guard this f5 pawn, but he forgets that now white can start pushing this b pawn further. And now it's better for black to capture this e4 pawn. This is because after takes, knight to b5, so that this knight can take some comfortable space. But after f4, he made a mistake by playing knight to b5. And the problem with that move is now white can bring back his knight to f3, creating more pressure over this e5 pawn. And if black captured this f4 pawn, then it will be completely losing because of takes, knight to d4 check, knight takes d4, king takes d4. And now look at these horrible pawn structure of black. And now I think you all understand that by that this position is winning for white. But after knight to b5, here white decides to capture on f5. And to win this game, now Kramnik just has to find this amazing move, knight to e6, so that he can give a check from d8 square. But what if black gives a check from b6 square? Then simply king to b3, and if king to d5, bishop to d8, targeting this knight on b6. And if king takes e6, bishop takes b6, e takes f4, king to c4, knight to c3 check, king to c5, king to e5, f3, covering this e4 square so that this king cannot enter. But knight to c2, okay, getting closer to these pawns. But b5, king to e6, bishop to c7, and now you can see no one can stop this pawn from promotion. But in the actual game, after this move, here Kramnik made a mistake by knight to f7, and that's a mistake because now black can give a check from this b6 square by knight to b6 check. This is because if king to b3, knight to d4 check, king to c3, knight to f3, and you can see now black is targeting this pawn on h2, and if he decides to push h3, knight to d5 check, and white has to lose this bishop. But in the actual game, after the move knight to f7, he missed that move, and instead he decides to capture on f4. And now to win this game, white has to just find the move knight to d7 check. But how can white win in this position? This is because after king to e7, now comes this amazing move f4. And obviously you cannot grab this knight due to the threat of king takes f7. So what if knight to h8 check? Then king to g7. And if knight to f7, knight to e5. And now I think you all can see that no one can stop this pawn from promotion because this knight is placed so that he can deflect this and simply white can push. But instead of giving a check from after knight to f7, here Kramnik made a mistake by playing f4. And now comes the most shocking part of this game. Basically, in this position, Anatoly Karpov resigned. Or maybe he might be lost on time, but this position is now completely equal because of the move which is knight to h8 check. This is because after king to h6, knight to f7 check, king to g6, knight to h8 check, king to g5, and finally king to g7. And now you can see black is going to give multiple checks, and this knight on h8 is completely stopped this pawn on h7 from promoting, and by this you can see this position becomes completely equal. This is your host Bison signing off. Bye bye.